People love the kind of behind the scenes or the man behind the man.
Making sure that people know that you're in it for them as well.
When people feel listened to and they feel heard, they're way more comfortable, they're way more confident, and they give you so much more because you're listening.
Hey everyone, so welcome back to Podfathers, where on this episode we're talking about interview techniques, aren't we, Tolu?
We are.
We are. I'm excited for this one.
Me too. This might be one of my favourites.
I think you're going to be the specialist in this.
Do you reckon?
I reckon so.
Okay.
I love watching your interviews. You're so fluid with them, so we're going to teach everyone else some hints, tips, tricks so they can follow some advice as well. So let's start with the atmosphere that you are creating when a guest is on. So this is whether it's, I guess, online or in studio or in person. So where's the first place you start? So let's go online. What would you be doing?
So I think what we're talking about is creating comfort.
Yes.
Really, like you get the best interviews when people are comfortable. And when we say the best interviews, we're talking about the best flow, people enjoy them, there's good engagement. You can get like interviews where it's very uncomfortable, you know, where people are like hostile and things like that. That's a different type of interview. That's not really what we're talking about, because we're talking about business podcasts where you want to build relationships. You want people to understand what your business does, see you as thought leaders. That doesn't happen when you're hostile in interviews. So what's really important with this is that we're creating comfort for the guests. So if I was doing it online, it comes from some of the conversation that you have before. Yep. So making sure that everybody knows what's about to happen. You're checking that they're okay on the day. Is there anything I need to be aware of that's happening for you today? Like, you know, is the delivery driver coming? Are your kids coming back? Whatever it is, understanding the other factors that could impact it.
And showing that you care as well.
Yeah. When people know that you care, then they know I'm not here to trip you up. I want you to perform really well in this. I want this to make you look really good. Yeah. I think when you're in the studio, it's a different environment because there's no delivery man coming. You're kind of locked away in the studio. So that's about, are you too hot? Are you too cold? Do you have some water? Do you want a snack? It's really taking care of the physical side of things and making people feel physically comfortable and then letting them know what's about to happen, how it's going to go. Okay, these are the cameras. This is where you don't need to look. We focus on looking at each other, blah, 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 making them comfortable with what's about to happen.
Yeah, and I love that. And I think a lot of people don't think about that. Guide your guest through the entire journey because maybe they've never done a podcast or they've never done a podcast in this setting. So the amount of people where they come in and our host will sit down and almost go straight into an interview and I've got to go, well, hang on a minute, let me explain. That camera is on you, this one's on them, we've got a wide here, just so it looks like I'm trying to showcase what we're doing. Yeah. And if you want to talk to camera, that's your camera there. And I think that's so important. And like I say, the physical aspect of things, just having a water on the side or a tea of coffee. I've got my water down here, you've got yours down there. Yeah, there you go. But it's important to run through all this. Even I always asked the guest and the host before we start, do any of you need the loo? And I've seen it before where they've gone no, but after about 40 minutes, I could see them going like this. And they're bouncing in their seat almost. Yeah. And I had one guest last week, 40 minutes into their episode, the host just went, "Are you okay?" Busting for the toilet. I've just been holding it for about 10 minutes. I just need to run off. So we just had to cut cameras and let him come back in. Yeah. But if we'd asked at the start and he'd been honest, he would have just gone for a wee in the first place. Yeah. But yeah, again, just asking those questions in the first place, rather than going, right, sit down, let's get on with the interview for me. You just want to make sure they're comfortable. So, and like I said, I love that you said online, you know, if you've got a delivery driver, anything else booked, just so we're aware. So if we need to stop, don't worry about it. We can stop and we just carry on and we can just edit it later. So yeah, I think making sure that people know that you're in it for them as well. Yeah. And you're trying to create that atmosphere of, we're working together on this. We want the best podcast for our listeners. So just tell me if you need anything.
And even when I'm online, I say, have you got a drink of water? And they show me and like, I know that, okay, you've got something. And if you need to drink your water, that's cool. You know, one of the things actually we were talking about before was checking areas to avoid. And I think that's really, really important. And that's something I do before every episode. Like, is there anything you don't want me to talk about? Yeah. Right. So there was one episode where actually I talked to this guy and I asked him about his team and I said something like, okay, how big's your team? And he started talking and he goes, I might need to make a bunch of those people redundant. So actually, can we not talk about that? You know? And it didn't come up when I asked him about it before, but even in the flow. And I said to him before, look, if there's anything that comes up that you're talking about and you don't want to talk about, just let me know in between. You know, so people know this isn't a one-shot thing. It's going to get edited. If anything goes the way you don't want it to, in the middle of it, just tell me, hey, don't want to talk about that anymore. And
that's so important for people to understand, is this is not a live show. No. If you say anything, we've even had it where someone said something, they looked a bit uncomfortable, and at the end they've come to us and gone, you know that bit where I said such and such, I don't think I'm really allowed to say that because of confidentiality agreements or whatever. Can you just edit that out? Yeah, no worries. But we also say at the beginning, don't worry. If you say anything, we'll just edit it out if you feel uncomfortable about it. And in a lot of cases, we actually send the full podcast to the guests as well before it gets released, just so they can watch it and go, yeah, I'm happy with that. Because as soon as it does get released, we know they're going to jump onto actually promoting that episode as well, rather than thinking, I'm going to see how people are going to react first before I get involved. So yeah, the sensitivity issues and restrictions is worth doing before you even start. So have half an hour, 20 minutes beforehand. Just say, look, I've got these discussion points. I want to talk about these. I want to delve into certain areas. But is there anything you don't want me to talk about? Just so I just remove it entirely. And all of a sudden, their guard goes down a little bit. And they're like, okay, cool. You do care about what I'm going to say, and you do care about those sensitive issues.
And I think you just have to be willing to, sometimes for me, I'm like, if you don't like the episode, we won't release it. And I know that can sometimes feel like a bit of a waste, but you have to be willing to do that for your guests. Because actually, if someone doesn't feel like it's the best representation, why would you release it anyway? So I know some people talk about like, release forms and stuff like that. And it's like, well, once we've recorded it, I now have the right. But why would you want to release something that someone doesn't want released? And you have to kind of settle that within yourselves that, look, we might have wasted the time and the money for the studio, but if they're not comfortable, why would you go ahead anyway? And you have to be very okay with the fact that sometimes they're not going to want it to be released, and that's okay.
Yeah, I've never approached it in that way. I totally get it. What we say to people as a guest is we will always send you the full episode before it gets released. So you can be completely happy with what you've said. If at that point you still want anything removed, we're happy to remove it. So they're going into the podcast thinking, okay, there's no danger here. You're not trying to catch me out.
Trying to catch me out.
And that's really important. I've never said, if you don't want it released, we won't release it, because especially the thing is, especially in a studio environment, you don't want to be doing that to your client, so the host who's paying for the studio space.
Interesting.
Because it's coming out of their budget. So for them to go, whoa, hang on a minute, well, of course we're going to release it, because they've paid for the time as well.
Why would they release it if the guest isn't comfortable? And do you know how many episodes I've had to not release in my whole life?
Really?
0. None.
Yeah.
Like, it's never happened, because most people get into it, they feel comfortable, you're not actually trying to trip them up. So there's no need for it ever to not be released. So I did an interview with a guy, and this was probably like this was the closest I ever got to not releasing one. And he'd had a mental breakdown. And he was actually...
What, on your podcast?
No. He'd had a mental breakdown before. I'd reached out to him. Everything was okay. We booked in the date. The date came, and he was like, I'm actually in like a mental health facility. I was like, are you sure you want to record a podcast? He was like, yeah, absolutely. Like, because he also wanted to be able to look back and do different things like that.
Interesting.
And I said, look, there is absolutely no pressure. We can record the episode. You watch it back. If you don't want it, we'll just bin it. But if it's in any way good for you, then let's do that. And he decided to actually release it and do stuff like that. And but that was the closest, and that was a really
that's quite an extreme thing, isn't it?
But even that ended up going out and was really good. And so I've never actually had to not release an episode. Yeah. But for me, that's just a comfort that people have.
Yeah, I think just creating comfort in any way you can when they come in. Also, just making sure it feels like a win-win scenario.
Exactly.
There's no way they're going to want to remove anything or lose their episode. They want exposure. That's why they've come on the podcast.
Exactly.
But just saying, don't worry, if you say anything, we'll remove it.
Take those bits out.
We'll give you the full episode before it gets released. Make sure you can vet it. And if you're happy with it, great, we'll put it on. And I think that just brings down barriers. So whilst they're sitting there, they're not overly thinking about or overly worried about, but if I say this wrong, it's going to make me look bad. So I think that's crucial, because you want those walls to come down. You want them to feel comfortable throughout the entire process.
Agreed.
Agreed.
And I think once that comfort is there, one of the things that I've got down is that you really want to start strong. So you want to do some introductions. You want to have something that gets the listener's attention really early in. And I think we have slightly different approaches, don't we, on how we do intros, right? So how is it that you do them?
So for us, we'd always shoot so let's say you got the host and the guest here. We would always shoot the intro in this position. So the host would be saying, right, today I'm welcoming Lisa onto the show. She's a beautician from such and such. We're going to be talking about this, that, and the other. Then you go straight into the episode. What we then find is when they discuss certain things on that episode, we look back at the end and go, actually, can we do the intro again? But this time mention what topics you've covered. Because when you start, you've got your bullet points, but you may go off-piste on certain things, or there might be some really profound things that come up that you delve into. So you want to make sure that's in the intro as part of your hook. So do the introduction as standard. Almost treat it as a practice run, lead into your interview, do the interview, and if you think you can revise that intro, do it again, and then we just in the edit, we lose the first one, put the newer one in. And you do it slightly different, which I quite like as well.
So I don't necessarily introduce the guest while they're there. I will do the episode and I'll just be like, Deren, welcome to the show. And then we go straight into it.
Yeah.
Then what I do after is once I've done the episode, I'll put it through some transcription, get the summary, get the key points, and then I'll do my own intro, just me to camera that says, hey, welcome to this week's episode. We're going to be talking to Deren. Deren is the owner of Cheeky Monkey Studios. I big the guest up that way. And then that then leads into the episode. So I tell people what's coming based on the key points from the conversation. But then I find sometimes people can be a bit awkward, like when you're introducing them. But I loved what you said when we were talking before, that actually sometimes it gives them a boost and it makes them feel a bit more connected to the host.
Yeah. I mean, imagine sitting here, I'm sat here with Lisa, award-winning psychologist. She's done this, she's got a book out. And then, hey, Lisa, thanks for coming on. She's sat there going,
like glowing.
Thanks very much.
Stop it.
So already it's set you off on a good start where she's like, oh, thanks for that introduction. And then because you've built that credibility already at the start, her guards have already come down. It's not like you're trying to clickbait anything into it or trying to catch her out. So for me, that's always a good way of starting when you've got a guest on, is do the intro in front of them. Yeah. And then if you need to revise the intro later because you've touched on certain topics that you hadn't thought about, you can do the intro again and say, hey, it's Lisa, award-winning psychologist, and today we're talking about this, this, and this. Because you've already discussed it in the episode.
I'm actually going to try it. I'm actually going to try and do some quite unique intros for the guests.
Right.
So that's going to be very interesting. I'm going to do some little research and maybe set something in they might not have told me and see if they like that.
Okay. Yeah. You'll get bonus points if they start blushing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, just try and see what works for you. But for me, I've always found, obviously it's going to be different in a studio environment, but if you're sat with them and going, hey, we're going straight into the interview, it doesn't sit quite as well as talking to camera and introducing them and just watching their reactions going, oh, thanks very much.
That's nice. I like that. I like that. And I think depending on the type of podcast that you do, so for example, I do a lot of tell me your story podcasts, where I want to know more about you. And so I try and start with a question that makes people feel really comfortable. A question that it's not a technical question, it's just about you. So one of the questions I ask is, okay, what makes you tick? And you can answer that however you want. Could
be business related or personal, family, whatever.
So that's really just about, okay, you know you really well. So you can actually answer that question. There's nothing tricky about it. You can take as long as you want to answer the question, but you can feel comfortable. So I try and start with a comfort question, or if it's a business, okay, so tell me about Cheeky Monkey. Why is it called Cheeky Monkey? That kind of thing where okay, that's a story that's going to make you happy.
Yeah.
Because that's something that you love. So I try and start with something a bit more like that they can really get into personally.
And you kind of just ease them into the entire interview.
Exactly.
One of the, we're going to try and use it a bit more. One of the best openers we saw for a podcast is a host idea. And she had a guest on, CEO of a company, SaaS company, software company.
Yeah.
When you see this guy I'm not allowed to mention who it is, but in magazines, etc., it's very serious. Everything about it is very serious. But the host said, I'm going to do something completely different. And they did a quickfire round. 10 questions, completely personal stuff about holidays and pets and everything else. It almost took him out of his comfort zone because normally he's just used to answering very technical questions about software. It's quite dull. So what he wanted to do was completely revise that and say, I want to know more about you personally.
Yes.
Like you say, what makes you tick? And doing the quickfire round kind of helped ease him into it.
I love that.
And then he just enjoyed the rest of the interview. So again, you don't normally associate this person with answering very personal questions. So it is good for the audience. I think they had some really good interaction as well off of that.
I think that's a really interesting point that you raise about out of your comfort zone, because I personally believe that there really great things often happen just outside your comfort zone. And really great interviews sometimes will take people just that little bit outside. Not to the point where they're freaking out, but to the point where oh, I've never thought about that before. And actually, this isn't something I normally answer. And they enjoy that kind of thing. So I think if you can find that sweet spot that might be just outside, I think you'll do really well for interviews.
And it's exactly that. It's not out of your comfort zone that you don't want to do it. It's more a case of,
it's just a bit of a stretch.
He's been on interviews where he's never been asked that. So he's come in prepped, going, I'm going to answer this, I'm going to answer this. And suddenly it's like, tell me about your childhood pet or whatever it was. Yeah. It's very personal stuff.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, this is strange. But then as soon as he started loosening up, and again, for things like Reels, it's great because you're seeing the CEO answering very personal questions that isn't related to software that you're always used to seeing. You almost become immune to that. So again, you have to try these different interview techniques to see what works with what guests.
Yeah. I think it's really important that people enjoy talking about themselves.
Yes.
As a general thing, people love talking about themselves. So if you can ask them interesting questions that they might not have heard before that can actually get to something deeper, I think those are some of the best things you can do.
Yeah, and also think about the reels you're going to create after the podcast, right? So if you've got all these technical questions fired at a software CEO, great. But isn't it going to be more interesting to also interlace some of the more personal answers that he gives about different things that you don't expect this guy to be answering? So from a reels point of view, you're watching something on social media going, it's completely out of your comfort zone, out of context. Then go, I want to find out more about the CEO from that personal level rather than just him talking about software. And
I think that people love the kind of behind the scenes or the man behind the man. You know, like, okay, so I see this guy on the TV all the time, but like, who really is he? Like, what actually goes on behind that? And I think that leads on to something that we were going to talk about anyways, good questions and questions that add depth, right? So everybody can ask kind of the surface level questions, but a really good interviewer is going to be able to take the answers that the guest gives and then dive a little bit deeper and then create some depth from that and then go in a slightly different direction than would normally be expected. And that's where some of the really good stuff comes from.
And people are so scared to do that. They're like, well, hang on, I've got my 10 questions here. I'll make sure I get those out of the way.
Yeah.
And let's just keep everything on track. We can't go off piece. It's like the whole point is you have to go off piece a little bit. If it goes completely off piece, you know to use your prompt cast to then bring them back in. But some of the, like I said, some of the best answers you get is delving deeper.
Yeah.
And I had someone in the studio last week, and I can't remember the example exactly. And he was watching a video on about sales techniques, and the interviewer had asked a question, and this leading salesperson had given an answer. It teed him up perfectly to ask another question to delve deeper into that mentality and that psychology, but he hadn't. He'd just gone on to the next question on his prompt card. He's like, it's just really frustrating because he's just teed you up a fantastic bit of content that you could have provided more value to your audiences by just going, oh, and how do you do this? But he didn't. He just stuck to his original script. And that's the important thing, is these prompt cards are not scripts. They are bullet points about things that you want to cover, but you have to just, and this is one thing you're good at, is active listening, is listen to what they're saying, let them go off piece a little bit, and then ask another leading question off of what they've said. Because if they're saying it, it's clearly important to them and they think it's relevant. So generally, you'll get some really good content out of those.
I couldn't agree more. And one of the things that I was taught was about what is it that your listener will want to hear. So like in that scenario that you just gave, the listener wanted, give me more of that.
Yes.
And if you're not aware of that, you'll just keep going through your points. But actually it's like, if I'm listening, what would I want to know from what he's just said? And that's something that's always in my mind, is like, what would a listener want to hear? And I think for a business podcast especially, sometimes it's the practicalities of how they made something happen. So if someone said, you know, I went from, you know, a grad to a VP in 10 years, I might be like, well, what were some of the things that you think made that possible? You know, I won't just be like, oh, great. And then it's like, okay, but practically, what did you do? And
what were the challenges you faced? That's what I want to know about, because there's clearly challenges along that ladder, isn't there?
Yeah. Like, how did you get your boss to sign off on that, even though you're super young? How did you feel when people actually told you to? Like, those kind of things that you can dig a little deeper into and people can take away and go, oh, okay, now when I face this challenge, this is how I can deal with it.
And they can relate to it rather than going, I did this to this and it was fairly straightforward. It's like, well, it wasn't. How do you deal with these different points and different challenges? Because that's, like you say, that's what the listener wants to listen and go, oh, okay, so when I face that, that's how you dealt with it. And it gives them a context during that journey.
And I think something that sets you up really well for that is asking really open questions. Like giving people the space to explore the question and to give different answers. And we talk a little bit about kind of going on tangents and going off piece. It's like, sometimes that's where the really good stuff is. And you have to find this balance between letting people go off a little bit, seeing what's there, but then if you know that actually there's a rough flow I need to go to, then you can absolutely come back to it. But you don't want to discourage people, personally for me, from going off tangent a little bit. I think there's some really good stuff that you find there.
But you also have to remember, you can edit this afterwards. So let them go off tangent on something else that they're passionate about. And if you think in the final edit, well, actually, I need to trim 15 minutes off of this, you can go and trim it. But during the interview, you've given them that space to explore the answers. And like I say, whether you're doing it online, so unless it's a YouTube live thing, and we're not really talking about that, are we? We are talking about creating podcasts. You can edit and do what you want. So if you get an hour and a half episode out of them, they feel comfortable, they've told you their stories, you can always trim it down to 45 minutes afterwards.
Or you can make it 2 different episodes, for example. You can have 2 different sides of the episode if you want. Like, there's so many different ways you can do it.
Yeah, or you treat it as bonus material. If you want to watch the full thing that's unedited, there's a bonus one to watch as well.
Exactly.
So, yeah, I think that's where the active listening and treating prompt cards and the research beforehand as a blueprint, as a guideline. And the main thing for prompt cards is you're not sat there going, I don't know what else to ask next. I've run out of ideas. At least you've got a few things on your list that you can talk about. But it is just a framework.
I think that active listening is one of the most important things, because I think when people feel listened to and they feel heard, they're way more comfortable, they're way more confident, and they give you so much more because you're listening. It's like they reward you for listening with more information. And that, for me, is one of the most important things about being an interviewer.
So explain active listening to me as well.
So active listening, from my definition, is proactively listening to what people are saying. So I'm not just listening so that I can respond. I'm listening to understand. And from my understanding is where I respond. I'm not just listening so that I can tell you about me. I'm listening so that I can find out more about you. Because that's always my aim, is to be like interested, not interesting. So most people, if you have a conversation with them and they talk about themselves a lot, they'd have enjoyed the conversation, right? I don't want them to go away thinking, oh, Tolly's really interesting. I want them to go away thinking like, Tolly was really interested in me. He really got to know me. He asked me some questions that people haven't asked me before. I told him things that I may not have thought about telling him before because I've listened really actively and asked more questions about it. So that's what it is for me.
Yeah, I think they know it's active listening because the next question you ask them, is it related to what they've just told you, or is it just the next thing that's on your prompt card? And again, sitting in the studio, we can see that happening a lot. So for us, a lot of it is to train the host to make sure they are active listening and how important that is, because they are the best interviews by far.
Yeah. And I think if you get active listening right, you can also start to create threads. So you might have told me 5 different things throughout the conversation. And if I've listened really well and understood really well, I can start to make connections between those things. And those connections is often where some really cool new stuff comes from, because they might not have made that connection before, or you might have made. So that for me is also really important, is listen and then almost like store it like I'm a data person, right? Store it like data, start to bring the data sets together and then create something new. And I think that makes for a really, really good interview.
But a lot of this also comes down to practice.
Yeah.
You can't naturally be as good as Tolu.
You're too good.
But yeah, I mean, active listening, you should be practicing that in life, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
I think it's so important. Too many people, like you say, are trying to be interesting, trying to say everything about themselves, funny quirks, funny jokes, and people go away going, well, that's a fairly self-indulgent conversation, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And that's what you don't want. A podcast should not be, as a host, self-indulgent.
Right.
You brought your guest in, bring them into the story, provide the value to your audience by telling your guest story. And that's absolutely critical.
And I love what you said about like, these are skills for life, right? So what we're talking about is podcast for business. And if you get really good at interviewing, even like prospect conversations and that kind of stuff become very different, because then you can be a bit more consultative because you really understand. You can offer people what they really want because you can actively listen.
You can become a troubleshooter rather than just a salesperson.
Exactly.
Because if you tell me a problem that is not on my little sales sheet, I can go, actually, based on what you've just said, we have got a different service we can provide you.
Exactly. It's such a good life skill just to be able to active listen. It makes your relationships better. Like, it's just generally a great thing to be able to do.
As opposed to selective listening when your wife's telling you what to do.
Yeah. Let's not go there. Let's not go there.
But it's also the equivalent, whether you've got a guest or not, or whether it's a co-host, it's exactly the same.
Yeah.
Like, I'm actively listening to what you're saying, what your answers are, rather than going, right, okay, next question is this.
Yeah.
You know, we are bouncing off each other. So whether you have got a guest or it's a co-host for your company, it's the same. You want that conversation to be free-flowing. And one of the worst things I see, and I try and train people out of, is sitting here doing this.
Yeah.
It's really annoying.
Yeah.
Because I can't possibly actively listen and try and read everything on my prompt card.
Yeah.
It almost turns into more of an interrogation going, cool, next question.
Yeah.
So please pick your head up, make eye contact with your guest or your co-host and have a normal conversation like you would do down the pub.
And I think it frees you, and it also takes off the pressure, because if I go into this as I'm going to have a good conversation with you, cool, like that's no pressure. But if it's like, okay, I need to get through every single one of these things and, oh no, I'm running, and like that is pressure. But if it's just like we're two humans having a good conversation, there's no pressure. And like I just have to be curious. You know, and that's what I'm all about, is like removing pressure, removing friction, because people perform better when they're relaxed. And this isn't even actually a performance. This is a conversation. But if I treat it like I have to do all of this, it's going to be a bit of a problem.
Yeah, and one of the things we say in our training is you should always treat this as a pub chat.
Yeah.
That camera is for the audience to voyeuristically watch in on your expertise, on your discussion, but it's just a pub chat. It's meant to be a conversation. If you make it too rigid, if you make it too corporate and stuffy and too structured based on these, you've already lost people in the first 1 minute anyway.
Yeah, because it's not authentic. That's not what people are here to watch.
Yeah, but just imagine, I use the example of eavesdropping on people at a barbecue, right? If they're having a really good conversation and I'm sat with you, I'm still kind of eavesdropping on them because they're just having a casual conversation.
Yeah.
But if it's a corporate stuffy conversation, I couldn't care less. I'm back in the room with you.
Yeah.
And that's what you want your audience to feel like, is you're just having a conversation with your guest, with your co-host. You should always have prompt cards. Because obviously we cover a lot of things in Podfathers per episode, and it's just human nature to forget certain things. So we want to make sure we tick certain things off of our list that we provide to you, but we're not treating it as questions.
No. And I think from what you just said, for me, it's really important that you help your guest or your co-host by giving them some of those prompts. You know, so you might be able to encourage someone to talk more about something else that they spoke about earlier, because they might have forgotten about that, or you might know something that you can actually bring forward. And I think helping people in that way is also really important.
Yeah, and I've seen people run it different ways. So a lot of people give questions prior to the interview, prior to the podcast. So as a guest, you can come on almost feeling more prepared. So if you've got funny stories, if you've got some anecdotes, case studies, anything like that, you can bring it to the table rather than finishing and going, oh,
I forgot about that.
I wish I'd mentioned this and that, and it could have been more interesting. So that works really well. And other people go, I don't really want to know what questions because I want to just give you my authentic answers. You are that person, aren't you?
Yeah.
And that's not being less prepared. It's just your skill set that you already have because you've done, 500 episodes or something. So you know what you're doing. But from a guest point of view, sometimes they like being given the questions in advance so they can prepare some interesting answers. Other times we've had guests go, I don't want to know any of your questions. I just want to come on and I'll answer as authentically as I can without any practice.
It's a really interesting balance between over-preparing, because sometimes when people over-prepare, it feels prepared. Like that's not really a genuine answer.
It's just rehearsed answers, aren't they?
And no one wants to listen to that.
No.
So I think one of the last things that I've got is kind of what happens after. So I think the interview, like being done, isn't when you're done creating a good interview. I think part of it is about thanking your guests. So, you know, whether you send an email as a follow-up or whatever it is, I think that it's really important to ask for feedback as well. Sometimes I do it straight after, and some people are cool with that. Sometimes I'll do it like a few weeks after and say, hey, thinking back to the conversation we had, how did you find it? What did you think? What could I have done better?
You'd leave it as long as that, a few weeks?
Sometimes, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Because some people are really good at like, okay, it's just happened in the moment, I'm giving feedback.
Fine.
Some people need some time to digest and different things like that. So I might check like, are you a in the moment person or a couple of weeks person? So I might find out that way and say, okay, what's best for you? I'm definitely I will tell you right now how I feel, and it's not going to change 2 weeks from now, so I'll give it to you now. But some people really prefer like, let me take it away, let me digest it, let me watch it back.
Let the dust settle and then figure out what I could have done better or what you could have done better to extract better answers off of me.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
So thank you, I would still send straight away.
Right.
But in terms of can you give me some feedback, I might wait sometimes for that.
Fine, okay. Yeah, I mean, the feedback thing is literally so important. I think some people have got egos, or they think, actually, that was a really good conversation. They walk away, watch themselves back and go, yeah, I did great. You should always be improving.
Yeah.
And the only way to improve is to get third-party feedback to say, well, you could have done this, you could have done that, you could have said this, you could have delved in a bit deeper there. And you need to keep taking that feedback on to understand how you can improve.
Yeah.
I mean, we had, you probably won't mind me saying, I won't say his name, probably about 6 weeks ago, he started his first podcast, a business podcast, and he'd brought on a guest. And it was it's a strange episode to start with because it was a really powerful emotional story to be telling. The lady's son had died when he was 17, medical conditions. So it was quite a heart-wrenching story in the first place. And she did fantastic to be able to tell that story. She was amazing. And for from his side, he didn't know where he was going to go with the conversation in terms of, could I dig deeper or am I being insensitive? Whereas if you'd prepped that in the first place and asked those questions to the lady and said, do you mind if, these are my questions, especially a sensitive subject, do you mind if I delve deeper? Can I ask these questions? If you feel uncomfortable, don't worry, I won't ask them. And so it became a bit more like an interrogation where she would give her answer and then he'd be back on his card and going, okay, next question is this. And it was just really awkward to watch. And he knows that, because the best thing was he came out of that interview and said, guys, I need some feedback off of that because I didn't feel too comfortable. I don't think I did the right thing. I don't think I did that interview justice. And we kind of analysed what he was doing, looking too much at the prompt cards rather than prompts or bullet points. It was 2-3 sentences.
You just get lost in that.
Which, of course, you're trying to read and give an answer. You can't possibly actively listen and know what your next question is going to be. So we sat down for an hour before his next interview. So he did one interview, a 1 hour break, then another interview in the studio. So within that hour, we said, right, break these down as bullet points, forget the sentences. You need to actively listen. So when someone's talking, you're literally just briefly looking down when you can, look at the next bullet point. But if they go off tangent, great, delve deeper. Ask those questions, because that's what the audience want. It's no good just going off your 10 questions. No. They've given you that information. That's permission to then ask further leading questions. And I'll tell you what, the transformation between the first episode and the second within the space of 2 hours was incredible. Just taking on that feedback straight away. He's on like episode 6 or 7 now, and he is absolutely nailing it. He's probably one of the best interviewers, hosts that we've got.
I love that, because it doesn't take that much adjustment to make things 10 times better. But it takes humility of asking, okay, I don't know if that went well or not. And even if you feel it went really well, still ask for feedback. And even one of the guys gave us some feedback on one of our episodes, right? Or 2 of our episodes maybe. And I think it's so important that we can be humble and say, okay, cool, let's take that feedback on and let's make the adjustments and let's make things better.
Again, why would you not? It's free feedback. So whether it's from people watching in or your interviewee, for them to say, actually, you could have delved deeper there because I wanted to tell that story, but you didn't. You moved on to the next one. You know to take that on board and do better next time. We've got people in the studio who are on episode 40, and every time they finish, she comes up to me going, was that a good episode? What could I have improved on?
I love that.
And that's why she's going to be a superstar down the line, because she's taken that feedback. She could go, I've done 40 episodes, I'm a pro now.
Yeah.
Absolutely not. Every single time she's like, right, what do I need to improve? Should I have asked more questions? Did I talk too much? And every time you're taking feedback. So yeah, again, whether it's online, in studio, in person, look for feedback and always welcome it.
One of the things I do actually sometimes, maybe like 3/4 of the way into the episode, is I'll say, sidebar, is there anything I've not asked you yet that I should have asked you? Or is there anything you want to go a little bit deeper into that we've not gone into yet? And actually that works really, really well as kind of 3/4 of the way in, still got some time that I can make the adjustment. People have a second to think and go, yeah, actually, sometimes they're like, yeah, could we talk about this or that? And I think that just works really, really well.
And you have to understand that people are on your podcast because they want exposure for something.
Exactly.
Whether it's their business or their fundraising event or something. So if they're sat there thinking, you've not asked me this question, you need to be able to say, okay, well, what else could I ask you that could help you promote your business or your expertise within the industry or your fundraising event? And that's an opportunity for them to go, I'll make sure you say about this and this, and ask those leading questions. But if you literally close off the interview thinking, well, I've ticked off everything on my list.
Yeah, it's not your list that matters.
It's not your list that matters. So that's critical. Ask for feedback during the interview, even prior to the interview, having that pre-research going, right, these are all the things that I've got down. Anything else you want to add now? And then just before you finish the podcast, is there anything else I've missed to help you promote on this podcast? And then afterwards, then like you do, is what else could I have improved on during our session together? I think it's just absolutely key component of being a good guest, having a good podcast, and always improving your podcast as well.
That, for me, is the most important thing. Always be improving. Yeah. And then last thing is ask them for referrals. Ask them for people, if they've enjoyed the process, then they'll happily give you other people that you can invite as well.
And I've never understood people who don't do that. If you've come onto my podcast, you've enjoyed the process, you've got some exposure on it, why can't I contact you and say,
exactly,
Tolu, have you got anyone else who might benefit from being on my podcast? And that's for you to say, I've got Jim, Bob, Sally and Gary. Here are their emails, and I think they'd love to be on your podcast because it's going to give them exposure. Great, I can now contact Jim, Bob, Gary and Sally and go, Tolu's recommended you to be on the podcast. Would you like to have a chat?
And a warm referral always opens the doors way better than if I reach out to those people randomly.
And it's so much more comfortable to do rather than just cold outreach going, could you come on my podcast?
Yeah.
It's just so much easier. So please do that. You know, if you've had a good conversation with someone, say to them, is there anyone else you know who could benefit from being on this podcast to tell their story? So,
definitely.
So yeah, I mean, for me, that covers, I've got no more notes in terms of doing that. But yeah, just bear in mind that you can edit a podcast. So let people go off tangent, let them go off piste, tell their story. You can edit the bits out that you think are fluff at the end, bring it down to your 45-minute episode. Any awkward pauses, AI is great at that as well, isn't it? Cut awkward pauses out. I think for me, those are the most important things in terms of interview techniques.
Agreed.
Is the active listening is crucial.
That's what I got.
That's what you got. So I think we'll end it there. And guys, like, follow, subscribe, share, comment as well, any ideas that you've got, and we will see you on the next episode.
See you next time.